muerto la reina, Señor. Morir estaba en su futuro. Ya habría habido un momento para tal palabra. El mañana, el mañana, el mañana se desliza de día en día con paso mezquino hasta la última sílaba del tiempo dado. Y todos nuestros ayeres han alumbrado a los necios en el camino hacia el polvo de la muerte. Apágate, llama fugaz. La vida es solo una sombra errante, un burdo actor que apenas un momento se pavonea y agita sobre el escenario y nunca vuelve a ser oído. Es un cuento contado por un idiota, lleno de ruido y de furia, y que no significa nada. William Shakespeare, Macbeth. Este fragmento de Macbeth, impresionante y muy conocido, define a la vida como una sombra errante, un burdo actor que apenas un momento se pavonea y agita sobre el escenario y nunca vuelve a ser oído. Y la vida es un cuento contado por un idiota lleno de ruido y de furia y que no significa nada. Inevitablemente, los grandes escritores, novelistas, dramaturgos y poetas se enfrentan finalmente en algún momento de su vida y su obra, y todos nosotros también, los lectores, al problema del sentido, a esta sensación de que o la vida termina en nada, y es un sinsentido total, o hay un sentido que no conocemos. Siempre me ha impresionado este final de Macbeth, que es verdaderamente estremecedor. Y hay mucho en el mundo de Shakespeare que pareciera, y esto lo digo simplemente como un lector, no como un experto en su obra, a producir la sensación de este sinsentido, de que la vida es un sueño, de que la vida es un cuento contado por el idiota y que hay un absurdo que late detrás de la existencia humana. Sin embargo, Joseph Pearce ha dicho, de una manera polémica, que Shakespeare sería un católico o habría sido un escritor católico. Quiero agradecer a Joseph Pearce estar aquí en Chile. Joseph Pearce es autor de obras muy importantes y significativas sobre grandes pensadores contemporáneos, escritores y pensadores como Tolkien, Solzhenitsyn, Chesterton, Wilde, Belloc. Pearce nació en Gran Bretaña, profesor en Oxford, y tiene una historia personal que él mismo nos va a contar en el curso del programa muy interesante. Es la historia de un converso, de alguien que peleó encarnizadamente contra todo lo que simbolizaba el mundo católico en el interior de Inglaterra, y en la cárcel terminó convirtiéndose al catolicismo. Joseph Pearce, muchas gracias por estar aquí, bienvenido a Chile y bienvenido a este programa Una Belleza Nueva. La primera pregunta que quería hacerle, porque lo acabo de leer a usted en el diario, el chocante catolicismo de Shakespeare, aparece en el Mercurio hace unos domingos atrás. Frente a todo lo que se ha creído siempre, todo lo que está de moda hoy día, los estudios de género, los movimientos feministas, lecturas relativistas y ateas de Shakespeare, usted plantea que Shakespeare en realidad fue un católico conservador. Me gustaría que me explicara eso, y sobre todo después de leer esta parte final de Macbeth.
Yes, indeed. That was why I called my article the shocking truth of the Catholicism of Shakespeare, because the ironic thing, of course, is to be a Catholic is probably the most shocking thing that anybody can be in today's secular fundamentalist environment. But I began very much as a skeptic about Shakespeare's Catholicism. I had friends who told me that, yes, Shakespeare was a Catholic. And I said, there's just not enough evidence. We don't know. And the only honest thing to be in such a situation is an agnostic. But one piece at a time, the evidence, like pieces of a jigsaw, began to confront me. And there's a point at which you reach a threshold. Where you think, well, wait a moment, you know, perhaps there is something in this. And at that point was when I began to study the whole issue myself. And in my book, my new book, which will be published in Spanish but not yet, it's just published in the United States, called The Quest for Shakespeare, I show the biographical and historical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism, because I don't think we can read the plays in an objective light until we know something more about the personhood of who Shakespeare actually was.
Ahora, siempre hemos escuchado, los que hemos estudiado literatura, se nos ha dicho que la obra hay que estudiarla en sí y no mezclarla con la biografía. ¿Qué piensa usted de aquello? Hay posturas radicales, hay lecturas biografistas o tendencias que tienden a ver la literatura desde la biografía del autor, más bien impresionistas, y hay otras visiones más contemporáneas que dicen que hay que centrarse en el texto y no entender la biografía. ¿Por qué es tan importante la biografía de un autor para entender un libro o un autor, una obra?
A superb question, and a crucial one, which is why I wrote my book. There are two ways of reading any work of literature. There is a subjective way and an objective way. The subjective way is where we don't take any notice of any context, including the author's own personality. And then we read the text narcissistically, so that the text reflects back to us our own prejudices. And bearing in mind that when we are reading one of these great works of literature, such as Macbeth by Shakespeare, we are being given the opportunity to grow into the space that that genius presents to us. If, however, we insist on reading the book purely subjectively, we are not allowing ourselves to grow at all because we are only having our prejudices reflected to us. There's a line from a song by the rock group U2 that says, U2, that says, if you want to kiss the sky, you have to learn how to kneel. And really we have to approach literary texts with the spirit of humility and try to read them objectively. And to read them objectively, we have to understand the personhood of the author, because the work is in some way an incarnation of the creative spirit of the author.
Lo que sabíamos, a ver, se ha dicho que de Shakespeare se sabe que hay elementos, hay lagunas, hay vacíos en su biografía importantísimas, ¿no? Hay muchos enigmas, ¿no? Se han levantado todo tipo de conjeturas, de hipótesis, en relación a Cervantes, por ejemplo, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. ¿Qué es lo que sabemos de ese catolicismo de Shakespeare que usted afirma, primero en la vida, y luego voy a preguntarle por la obra? ¿Por qué usted afirma que Shakespeare es católico? ¿Cuáles son las bases o los fundamentos o los argumentos que justifican esta afirmación tan radical, digamos, y tan provocativa?
Well, basically, what we still have of Shakespeare's life, aside from the conjectures and the anomalies and the vacuums, because these are all things that anybody can make of what they will. But what we do have are legal documents, we have wills, we have court cases, we have evidence from the actual life of Shakespeare and Shakespeare's family. So, for instance, we know that Shakespeare was brought up in a militantly Catholic family. And we have to remember this was in Queen Elizabeth's England, when it was illegal to be a Catholic, and where Catholic priests were being hanged, drawn and quartered, brutally executed. His father was fined for being a militant Catholic in 1592, during the period that Shakespeare was writing his plays. Shakespeare's mother, we know, was from one of the most notorious Catholic families in England. Many of Shakespeare's cousins, several of Shakespeare's cousins, were executed for their Catholicism. We know that Shakespeare's daughter, Susanna, in 1606, again, in fact, I think the same year that Shakespeare was writing Macbeth, was fined for her militant Catholicism. We know that Shakespeare left most of his wealth to his daughter Susanna, the Catholic daughter, and left very little to the other daughter who married a Protestant. We know that the vast majority of the other benefactors of his will were local militant Catholics, defiant Catholics in the Stratford-upon-Avon area. For instance, I could go on, but these are documented facts, not conjecture.
Ahora, si uno lee Shakespeare, como un lector ingenuo, no como un experto, si uno lee este final de Macbeth y lee otros finales, momentos feroces, el Rey Lear, etcétera, etcétera, Hamlet tiene la sensación de que estamos ante un mundo desesperanzado, donde el hombre finalmente, donde de repente se desencadena la tragedia, donde el hombre se encuentra con el sinsentido, se encuentra con la muerte, se encuentra con el vacío, se encuentra con la nada. ¿Qué habría dentro de la obra de Shakespeare, ya no biográficamente, que pudiera justificar una visión católica del mundo?
Well, again, this is a big question, and you know, with Shakespeare's Catholicism in his plays, we live in an age where we have to give sound bites, instant answers. Shakespeare could not be overt about his Catholicism because he would be in prison. So it's a bit like a dissident writing in the Soviet Union. That if you're going to represent your dissident views, you have to do it in a circumspect fashion. And for instance, Macbeth, which is arguably, along perhaps with Othello, the darkest of Shakespeare's plays. So you have certainly given us the darkest picture. Was written in about 1606, which was at the time one of the darkest times for Catholics in England, because they believed that when Queen Elizabeth died, that the new king, James I, would liberate them from this 40 years of persecution. And when he comes to the throne, there are some plays by Shakespeare that were written about the time that King James came to the throne, such as Measure for Measure, which are very light and relatively light and overtly Catholic, with the heroine being a religious sister. But then all of a sudden the persecution recommences. And this was the hardest time because the Catholics were waiting for Queen Elizabeth to die. And so you were just waiting and waiting and waiting. Because when she dies, everything will be all right. And then she dies, and then you get a young king comes to the throne who does the same thing. And you think this is never going to end. So the plays around this time, Shakespeare's, the darkest plays, represent the darkest moments of Catholicism. But see, when even the passage you're talking about, what Shakespeare, the dialectic that Shakespeare's with is Machiavellianism, with those who are purely cynical. And many of Shakespeare's works contain a central ingredient of memento mori, remember death, because death is the one thing that keeps us grounded. So in that we see, again, Lady Macbeth as a personification of evil. Some critics have likened her to Queen Elizabeth. I'm uncomfortable with crude allegorical readings, but certainly Shakespeare experienced as a Catholic Machiavellianism at its worst. And in Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, we see Machiavels at their worst. And we are told that ultimately life is for eternity, not for time. So to squander your eternal inheritance in a life of Machiavellian self-gratification is myopic. It signifies nothing, to quote from the play.
¿Habría algún fragmento o un monólogo o una cita que usted recuerde de Shakespeare donde se pudiera ver la visión, a lo mejor no explícitamente, pero la visión profunda cristiana del mundo?
Yes. Let me give you another example. King Lear. The whole of the play of King Lear turns on Cordelia's refusal to gratify her father's desire that the three daughters tell him that they love him and all of their love is his. And Cordelia's two other sisters play the game and they get their earthly material reward. Cordelia, who is the one who loves King Lear the most, and the one who King Lear loves the most in reality, refuses to play this game. And she says she will love and be silent. And she is the one who truly loves. And she says, I cannot give to you the love that belongs to another. I can only give you the love that is due to you as a father. So for instance, if I get married, so some of my love I have to give to my husband. I cannot give it all to you. And of course, for a Catholic who understands Catholic ecclesiology, in the Gospel, Christ is always referring to himself as the bridegroom. And the church is the bride of Christ. So there is a very powerful metaphor here that basically Cordelia is saying, I cannot render unto Caesar the things that are not Caesar's. And this is exactly what Catholics in England were being asked to do. They were being asked to sign oaths of allegiance to King Henry VIII and then Queen Elizabeth I, which said specifically that you accept the King of England or the Queen of England as the head of the church. And Catholics in conscience had to make a decision. Cordelia in conscience makes her decision and is forced into exile, which many Catholics were forced into.
Para nosotros acá en Chile, Sudamérica, es difícil imaginarnos esta división tan feroz, tan brutal, casi esta guerra entre un mundo protestante y un mundo católico, un mundo que se odia, que se desprecia mutuamente, que se desdeña mutuamente, que comparten territorios, lengua, idioma, origen, pero esta guerra intestina entre el protestantismo y el catolicismo. Me gustaría que me explicara brevemente por qué y en qué consiste esta división tan feroz al interior del mundo cristiano en Inglaterra, que para nosotros es algo impresionante visto desde afuera.
Yes, I would say first of all, of course, that we live in a sinful world and hatred and division is not something which is peculiar to Elizabethan England. There have been many divisions in Chile and in Chile's history. You know, you have the communists and you have the dictators and they hate each other, and so this division is not something unique. But the thing we need to realize is that in England, the Reformation was something very different to what it was in Germany and in France. Calvin and Luther had ideas. Now, from a Catholic perspective, I believe those ideas were wrong, but they had ideas. And the division in Europe in the Protestant Reformation was about ideas. What is a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian? How do we get to heaven? Good questions, questions that deserve to be discussed. In England, however, King Henry VIII was having an affair with Anne Boleyn and wanted a divorce from his true wife. When the Pope refused to give him a divorce, he declared himself head of the Church of England. So the whole Reformation in England is far more Machiavellian and sordid and cynical and not based upon ideas. And it's that Machiavellian sordidness which Shakespeare is in a dialectic with.
Ahora, usted habla en uno de sus libros de la feliz Inglaterra antes de la Reforma. ¿En qué sentido me gustaría que me explicara eso? ¿Por qué Inglaterra era feliz antes de la Reforma?
Well, we've heard the phrase that history is written by the victors, and the history of England was written by the Whig historians who were the Protestants. But there's been some very good historical work done in the 20th century, most recently and most notably by Eamon Duffy in his book Stripping of the Authors, which shows that England was contented with Catholicism, and the English did not embrace the Reformation. The Reformation was forced upon them, so that we have Henry VIII in the 1530s declaring himself head of the Church of England. By Shakespeare's time, in the 1580s, 50 years later, the majority of Englishmen are still Catholics. And the authorities are trying to bully them and browbeat them into accepting the new established religion. But the English people didn't want it, and you know, we saw that there were more monasteries per capita, more monks and nuns per capita, per head of population in England than there were in other countries of Europe. Canterbury and Walsingham were two of the major Christian shrines that were destroyed by Henry VIII, but people travelled from all over Christendom to those shrines.
¿Cuáles son las diferencias fundamentales desde un punto de vista teológico entre el anglicanismo y el catolicismo? ¿Cuáles son las diferencias si uno tuviera que ir a la esencia de las diferencias? Si usted pudiera explicarlas gráficamente para un sudamericano católico, donde la presencia del mundo anglicano es minoritaria, sabemos muy poco. ¿Cuáles son esas diferencias fundamentales?
Well, we have to go back to the roots of the Anglican Church itself, which, as I've just said, was not founded on principle but on pragmatism, on the pragmatic will of the king. Now, the result of that is, from the very beginning, the Anglican Church was a compromise, and from the very beginning it had what became known as the High Church and the Low Church. And the High Church considered themselves to be Catholics, and the Low Church considered themselves to be Protestant, but they were both members of the same church, and they disliked each other. And this confusion and conflict has continued in the history of the Anglican Church for the 450 years since it's been formed. And now we see, of course, in the Anglican Church a complete collapse theologically, so that the Anglican Church is in steep decline. The Catholic Church is now the largest Christian denomination in England for the first time in 500 years since the Reformation. So because the Anglican Church, because this compromise could not hold, and in the end they started to dilute Christianity itself, what C.S. Lewis called Christianity and water, so that it becomes weaker and weaker and weaker and follows the zeitgeist and really in the end ceases to be distinguishable from the culture at large, which is why now in England, if the media wants to know what the Christian church believes about a certain political issue, it asks the Catholic Cardinal of Westminster and not the Archbishop of Canterbury.
¿Es verdad que usted se convirtió al catolicismo leyendo a Chesterton, el célebre autor de Ortodoxia, La esfera de la cruz y otros libros extraordinarios, un escritor que aquí conocemos muy bien y queremos mucho? Me gustaría que me contara su historia. Usted fue militante de un movimiento bastante radical, que era, me parece, el Frente Nacional, en un contexto del problema de la inmigración en Inglaterra. Peleó fuertemente contra el mundo católico, representaba para usted todo lo que era más odiable, ¿no? Fue fanático en esa línea y de pronto estuvo preso muy joven, 2 veces en la cárcel, y leyendo a Chesterton se convierte. Me gustaría que me contara brevemente quién era usted y qué pasó que lo hizo convertirse a través vía Chesterton al catolicismo.
Well, yes, I was a very, very angry young man, and I joined the National Front, which is a white supremacist, perhaps neo-Nazi organization when I was 15 years old, and became the editor of the Youth Movement's newspaper, and that was why I went to prison for publishing material likely to incite racial hatred. I was also very anti-Catholic and became involved with the Protestant paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland, the terrorist groups in Northern Ireland. So there were, I imagine, few people in the world further from the Catholic Church than I was. So how does the conversion happen in those circumstances? Well, we had violent demonstrations on the streets between the Trotskyites and us. And one of the things that the communists would shout was, "You are just the stormtroopers of capitalism." You know, and my attitude was, you know, I may not be a communist, but I refuse to accept their position that if you're not a communist, somehow, you know, you are the problem. I believe there had to be different ways of looking at these issues. So someone said, "Have you looked at the distributist ideas of Chesterton and Belloc?" And I hadn't, of course, and I didn't know who these people were. But I was interested, and this person said, "You have to read one essay by Chesterton." So I said, "Okay, where is it?" "This essay is in this book." So I bought the book. The essay is 3/4 of the way through the book. So I start reading from page 1. And this was a book written by Chesterton in 1935, shortly before he died, and 2 years after the Nazis came to power. And amongst the essays, most of which were defending the Catholic Church against its enemies, were essays attacking the Nazism and the new heresy of race. And I found myself confused because I loved what Chesterton was saying for the most part. I loved his personality. It's as if he was coming out of the page and being with me like we're here now. And yet, of course, there were some things Chesterton was saying, such as, you know, aspects of his Catholicism and this anti-racism that I wasn't comfortable with. But I loved Chesterton enough that I began to read more and more. And C.S. Lewis, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, says, "A sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading." And it's true that a sound racist cannot be too careful of his reading either.
Bueno, ¿usted recuerda el momento exacto en que se convirtió, el momento en que dejó de ser el Joseph Pearce que era y de repente se transformó en el 8? ¿Es un momento? ¿Esa conversión es una conversión intelectual? ¿Es una revelación? Porque su historia es como la historia un poco de Pablo de Tarso. Usted es como un Pablo de Tarso británico, ¿no? Que cae del caballo fulminado después de perseguir a los cristianos, se convierte violentamente en un católico. ¿Cómo fue ese momento? ¿Qué pasó en usted internamente?
Well, I certainly don't believe I deserve to be compared with St. Paul, but thank you for the compliment. But there are 2 types of conversion, it seems to me. There is the all-of-a-sudden conversion of a St. Paul that you mentioned, and there is the slow evolutionary conversion of a St. Augustine. And I think that my conversion was actually probably more of the latter. I think there were a few St. Paul on the road to Damascus moments, but generally speaking, it was this slow healing. So, for instance, I first read Chesterton in 1980. When I was 19 years old, and I entered the Catholic Church in 1989. So 9 years later. And of course, you begin by reading Chesterton, but then you start reading Chesterton's friends. So I started reading Chesterton, and then Belloc, and C.S. Lewis, and John Henry Newman, and eventually Thomas Aquinas, you know, and St. Augustine himself, Confessions. It was largely an intellectual process, but of course, you know, there's a connection between fides et ratio, between faith and reason, and my head and my heart were in fact in conflict, and I talk about it being like an arm wrestle inside me, inside my intellect and inside my heart, and it took 9 years. But let me give you an example of a St. Paul moment. During my second prison sentence, somebody sent me in some rosary beads. And now I, as an anti-Catholic, hated rosary beads. We used to sing a song in Northern Ireland attacking rosary beads. But now, when I went to prison, they process you. You have to go through a certain routine when you go to prison on your first day. And one of the things they ask you is, what is your religion? And they asked me this question, what is your religion? And I just stopped and I said, Catholic.
Yeah.
Wow, what have I just said, you know? And then I say, a few days later I get these rosary beads, and I've never prayed in my life, but I find myself wanting to pray. Now, I can't pray the rosary because I don't know the Hail Mary, I don't know the Glory Be, I don't know the Creed, and I was taught the Our Father at school, but it was a long time ago and I'd forgotten it. So, of course, I can't pray the rosary, but I started to just mumble and fumble inarticulate prayers on the beads, and immediately answers started pouring in. So it's as if my intellect had just paved the way, but it could only go so far. And at some point, I had to pray. I had to make that direct contact. And when I made that direct contact, answers started flooding in. And I started to go to Mass for the first time in prison.
Bueno, tal vez eso mismo que le ocurrió a usted en su vida es el origen de que se haya dedicado usted a estudiar la historia de escritores, ateos, agnósticos, anglicanos, que se convirtieron al catolicismo. Toda una oleada, hay una especie de, usted lo llama renacimiento literario católico que ocurre en Inglaterra desde el siglo XIX, de Newman en adelante. Y este libro interesantísimo, Escritores conversos, la inspiración espiritual en una época de incredulidad, pero también ha publicado un libro sobre Tolkien, donde usted hace una lectura hombre y mito, muestra que el catolicismo es central en la obra de Tolkien para entender El Señor de los Anillos, que no se puede separar, y los últimos libros, entre otros, hay un libro sobre Oscar Wilde, también le encontró una cercanía al catolicismo, vamos a ver, tan sorpresivo como lo de Shakespeare, Oscar Wilde, La verdad sin máscara, y un libro sobre este gran profeta ruso, Solzhenitsyn, Un alma en el exilio. Estos son los últimos dos libros. Vamos a ir primero a los escritores conversos. ¿Qué pasó en Inglaterra que de pronto todos los escritores y todos los ateos, los anglicanos se empezaron a convertir en católicos? ¿Qué fiebre, qué locura ocurrió? ¿Cuándo parte esto y por qué?
Well, again, when one is a convert, one becomes fascinated by other converts and other conversion stories, other people who took the same path I did, but earlier. And of course, many of these people were themselves very influential upon my own conversion. So I became fascinated in these people. And then I began to realize, studying these people, that there was a movement going on, that these people weren't islands in isolation. They were actually influencing and impacting and working with each other. So you had a network of minds and a network of grace going on here that constituted a real literary movement, which culminated, quite frankly, in many and perhaps most of the most important writers of the 20th century being converts to Catholicism.
Eso es impresionante, es muy impresionante. Y lo otro que impresiona, esto partió en Oxford, ¿no? Y tengo entendido que una de las raíces importantes fue Newman. Y me gustaría que me contara quién es Newman y qué es lo que pasó con él. ¿Y por qué es tan importante en este movimiento de conversión?
Well, basically, Newman was crucial because he was the leader of the Anglo-Catholic movement in the Church of England. You remember that I mentioned that there was a high church in the Anglican Church and a low church. Well, John Henry Newman was the leader of the Anglo-Catholics, the high church, and he was seen as a great intellectual and a very holy man, and it was believed that he was destined for the highest honors in the Anglican Church. So when he converts to Catholicism, seen as a great intellectual and a man of great sanctity, it sent shockwaves through the establishment. They could not believe it. And the thing about these shockwaves is it made Catholicism, for the first time in 300 years in England, intellectually respectable. And even, very quickly, intellectually fashionable. So that many, many other significant figures began to convert to Catholicism in Newman's wake. So Newman converted in 1845, and this is really the date of the beginning of the Catholic cultural revival.
¿Qué encontraron estos escritores, estos artistas de primer nivel, personajes de la talla intelectual de un Chesterton, de un Knox, de un Evelyn Waugh, de un Belloc, etcétera, de un Graham Greene? ¿Qué encontraron en la Iglesia Católica que no había en el anglicanismo, por ejemplo? ¿Por qué no se convirtieron al anglicanismo? ¿O por qué no se mantuvieron en el anglicanismo? ¿Qué había en la Iglesia Católica que resultaba tan atractiva y que obligaba muchas veces a saltar por encima de su propia historia personal, de su familia, de sus amigos? ¿Qué había en esa Iglesia Católica de novedoso, de nuevo e interesante? Esto se lo pregunto porque para nosotros sudamericanos el catolicismo forma parte de nuestra cultura, nuestra tradición familiar. Al revés de Inglaterra, vivimos inmersos en el catolicismo y puede ser más novedosa la iglesia anglicana ortodoxa que la católica. ¿Qué había de novedad en el catolicismo para ellos?
Yes, I don't think it was necessarily novelty. I think what was being searched for was certainty. And I think that people saw within the Anglican Church this element of compromise and uncertainty, so that the low church were never in harmony with the high church, that people began, if they understood history. Newman said that the more you understand history, the less you are an Anglican. So the more that people began to understand history, the more they realized that the Anglican Church was bogus. It was set up as a whim of a king. It's not the true church. So once you begin to realize that Anglicanism is not the true church, you start to ask, okay, well, what is the true church? So you start looking. And the other thing I would say as well is we need to realize that some of these converts were not from Anglicanism, they were from atheism or agnosticism. These converts came from all directions. It's almost as if the Catholic Church became a magnet for all of these great minds and these great artists for this 100-year period.
Me llama mucho la atención, nosotros, Sudamérica es un continente marcado por la raíz hispánica y también el catolicismo popular es un catolicismo más bien del corazón, un catolicismo de la emotividad, del culto a la Virgen María en México. Nuestra relación con la religión es más emotiva que intelectual, salvo tal vez en una élite intelectual muy... Aquí aparece en cambio una fe que llega más por la razón y por la voluntad que por el corazón. Eso me impacta profundamente. ¿Eso es algo, un rasgo británico, que es un país más racional? ¿O qué hay? ¿Por qué estas conversiones no se dan primero por el corazón, por la emoción? Incluso hay varios de estos personajes que se convierten no sintiendo nada emocionalmente, sino que convencidos racionalmente. ¿Por qué se da esta conversión así en Inglaterra, en este grupo de gente, y no de otra manera? Como pienso en un Froissart en Francia, un tipo, André Froissart es un intelectual que era ateo, que entra a una iglesia, cae de rodillas, tiene una experiencia mística, etc. En Chile también tenemos varios casos de conversiones así. Llama la atención que esta conversión sea racional y no emocional.
These are very good questions. They make me think, which I like. I think that the answer is maybe in twofold. First of all, I believe it is dangerous for a Catholic to only be a Catholic emotionally. If, as the Holy Father John Paul II made clear, and indeed as the Church has made clear for 2,000 years, that faith and reason have to be in harmony. So if your faith is not in harmony with your reason, there's a conflict there, a bit like the conflict in the Anglican Church I'm talking about. However, if it's true, which it is, that having a pure emotional Catholicism is inadequate and dangerous. It's also true that having a purely rational Catholicism is inadequate and dangerous. And my theory is, and I haven't even thought about this until you asked that question. I have to come to Chile to be asked fundamental questions. There's something in the English character that doesn't like to show emotion. So, for instance, where... So,
sí, por ahí va, por ahí va.
You've hit the point. So, for instance, when Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene say that, and C.S. Lewis say that when they became Catholics, or in Lewis's case, you know, an Anglican Christian, there was no emotion involved at all. I don't think they're being completely honest. I don't think they're telling a lie. I think they may consciously think that. And the reason I'm saying that is I was convinced for several years after my conversion that my conversion was an intellectual process, that it was these writers and these ideas that brought me to Catholicism. And it was only later, when my faith became more settled, that I began to realize, no, there was an emotional aspect to the whole thing as well. They were dancing with each other. The intellectual and the emotional were in harmony. They were dancing. And one was feeding off of the other the whole time. And yes, the intellectual component was crucial, but it wasn't alone. And I think, and if you'd actually study the life of Evelyn Waugh or Graham Greene, there were all sorts of emotional things going on in their lives around the same time that they were converting. So there's a mixture of both, and it's not a purely intellectual conversion.
Usted plantea en este libro que lo que de alguna manera trajo Chesterton y otros fue un reencontrarse con una verdad objetiva, ¿no? Esa verdad objetiva está conectada sobre todo con una filosofía escolástica. Chesterton escribe Ortodoxia, escribe el libro sobre Santo Tomás de Aquino. Es volver hacia atrás históricamente desde el punto de vista filosófico a una filosofía que plantea la verdad como algo objetivo. Todo el mundo moderno está fundado desde Descartes en el pienso, luego existo, en el predominio de la subjetividad. ¿Por qué este regreso atrás, esta especie de involución a una filosofía que se supone superada, filosóficamente hablando?
Well, I would say that the ultimate definition of a regression is a move into oneself. And an ultimate definition of progress is to go beyond oneself. And ultimately, we have the situation is truth out there, or does it merely exist in here? And I think any honest man, in moments of serious thinking, knows that he is not the center of the universe, nor is he the arbiter of truth. That the truth is beyond. To return to Shakespeare, the buffoon of a character, Polonius in Hamlet, says in his advice to his son, "This above all to thine own self be true." No, and really that is just saying that this above all be selfish. And Shakespeare shows the idiocy of that in Hamlet. And Shakespeare shows that this above all be true to the truth beyond the self. That we have to become selfless, we have to become objective in order to understand reality. And to me this is progressing beyond the prison of the self to the great world beyond the self, of which we are part, and an integral part, but we are not the center of the universe.
¿Qué es la verdad? Ahí está Pilatos también, ¿no? Enfrentándose a Cristo en la famosa escena. Pero ¿qué es la verdad? ¿Y qué significa la verdad objetiva? Porque uno piensa en la verdad objetiva, piensa más bien en la verdad de la ciencia. Si habla de objetividad, piensa en una verdad científica. Pero ¿cómo puede ser algo que es una fe, que es un salto más allá de la razón, ser verdad objetiva? Yo sé que es una pregunta difícil y amplia, pero por lo menos dar alguna pista sobre esto.
Well, you're trying to make me uncomfortable, thank you. The obvious and easiest answer to Pilate's question, what is truth, is Christ's answer, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But ultimately, the irony, of course, is that the Enlightenment, the worship of rationalism, the worship of reason without faith, of the head without the heart, led in one way to the worship of objectivity in empiricism, in the worship of science and the belief that science can answer all the problems that confront humanity. And on the other hand, and at the same time, leads to this radical subjectivism which doesn't believe that there's any such thing as truth, scientific or otherwise. So basically what we see is the Enlightenment begins with the worship of the head, with a faithless reason, and then there's a reaction against that in Romanticism, which is an irrational faith, but not necessarily in God, but in ourselves maybe. And what's happened is we've severed that crucial connection between the head and the heart, between faith and reason, and what we get is anarchy. G.K. Chesterton said that when man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing, he believes in anything. And this is the anarchic situation we find today.
¿El hombre no puede vivir sin creer?
A man cannot live without believing, without despairing.
¿Y por qué sería la verdad una institución? En este caso una iglesia católica que tiene una historia, que es histórica. Habiendo tantas civilizaciones, están los chinos, que van a ser en poco tiempo mayoritarios, ellos no son católicos, está el mundo indio, está el mundo... Es decir, ¿por qué pretendería la Iglesia Católica constituirse en una verdad objetiva, en la verdad? No puede sonar un poco presuntuoso, no puede sonar un poco iluso incluso, a la luz de otras culturas y de otras tradiciones, el mundo islámico, el mundo judío. ¿Cómo decirle a ese mundo que la verdad está en una iglesia determinada históricamente, además, que tiene un origen histórico determinado?
Yes, if Jesus Christ is not the Son of God, the Catholic Church is a sham. It's all rooted on whether or not Jesus is who he says he is. But if Jesus is who he says he is, he founded a church. And in many respects, the survival of that church, in spite of the sin of its members, including popes and bishops and priests, in spite of the sin of its members, Chesterton again said that the survival of the Catholic Church for 2,000 years, in spite of the sin of its members, is proof of its divine inspiration. And the other thing we need to remember is, that we don't have to play the numbers game, majorities or what have you, because the statistics, can be used in any way. As regards the number of Catholics, there are probably more Catholics in the world now than ever. But the most important thing, of course, is the Catholic Church is not just here. This is the church militant, the church on earth. But there is the church suffering in purgatory and the church triumphant in heaven. And that church is forever, it's for eternity. The church we see in time, that we are part of temporarily here, is like the life of Christ. It's the incarnation, but the incarnation enters eternity. And ultimately, the mystical body of Christ that is the whole church. And the church includes angels, and it exists in heaven.
Quiero volver ahora a esta generación, a esta playa de escritores tan significativa. Vamos a mostrar una fotografía muy hermosa. En realidad, más que una fotografía, parece fotografía, pero es una pintura. Este célebre cuadro, de grandes dimensiones, pintado en 1932, donde vemos, que está en la galería, en National Portrait Gallery de Londres, hay tres grandes escritores aquí. Está, en primer lugar, G.K. Chesterton, del que hemos hablado, muy voluminoso, un hombre gozador, sabio, lleno de sentido del humor, un tipo extraordinario. Hilary Belloc y Maury Baring. ¿Baring o Baring?
Baring.
Hablemos de esos tres amigos, de esa amistad. ¿Quiénes fueron ellos? Cuéntenos un poco. Sabemos más de Chesterton, pero no conocemos a los otros. ¿Y cómo se cultivó esa amistad? ¿Y qué había ahí en esa relación, en esos tres amigos? En estos tres mosqueteros del catolicismo británico.
Well, the three were great friends, and they again influenced each other. Belloc was very unusual amongst this group in being virtually the only cradle Catholic. He was born a Catholic and remained a Catholic. Most of the others were converts. And he was very influential on Chesterton's conversion. Chesterton was very influential on Maurice Baring's conversion. The three men became great friends. Maurice Baring wrote quite a few best-selling novels during the 1920s particularly. Belloc wrote some very important works of history, some very, very good poetry and novels. Chesterton is the best known, and perhaps rightly so. Now, the Chesterton Society is one of the largest literary societies in the world. I should be speaking at the the Chesterton Conference in the United States in 2 weeks' time, and there will be 800 or 900 people there, which is one of the largest literary gatherings in the world, which is wonderful to see. And one of the reasons I think people love Chesterton, because he has a great mind and he's a great philosopher, but he makes philosophy fun. He has a great sense of humour, a great joie de vivre. And I'll give you an example of Chesterton's humour. During the First World War, as you rightly said there, he was a corpulent, large man. And someone came up to Chesterton in a bus in the streets of London and gave him a white feather and a sign of cowardice, and said to him during the First World War, "Sir, why are you not out in the front?" And Chesterton said, "Madam, if you go around to my side, you will see that I am." And again, a perfect riposte, because Chesterton was so fat, if he was in the trenches, I mean, he would never be able to get out of the trenches. He was not fit to fight.
Había algo en Chesterton que lo hacía ser él, que hizo que llorara tanta gente, amigos, que fuera verdaderamente un gran duelo para muchos, que se sintieran huérfanos cuando se fue Chesterton. Esta mezcla de inteligencia, de bondad, de humor, de sentido común, es una especie de Santo Tomás de Aquino, pero literario, contemporáneo. A ver, ¿cuáles son los elementos que hacen esta peculiaridad de Chesterton como escritor?
One of the most important things for me in why Chesterton was so loved was something he said in his autobiography about his relationship with his brother. He said, "We were always arguing, but we never quarreled." Now, an argument is when two people are together across a table, a bit like us now, and we're both interested in coming to the truth. And we have charity for each other, and the important thing is not who wins the argument, but at the end of the argument, both of us are closer to the truth than we were at the beginning. A quarrel is an argument in the absence of charity, where basically we're more concerned about winning the argument and we don't care about the other person. In fact, we might hate the other person because he disagrees with us. Chesterton made so many intellectual enemies in his life without making any personal enemies. So, for instance, people like George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, who Chesterton was arguing with throughout the whole of his career, considered him one of their greatest friends. They loved him. And for me, for someone who can live a life of intellectual engagement without making any intellectual enemies is a sign of sanctity.
Si usted tuviera que recomendarle a un lector chileno que quiere entrar en el mundo de Chesterton, ¿cuál sería el itinerario? ¿Por qué libro habría que partir para entrar en el mundo de Chesterton?
Well, I'm not saying this in order to try to sell one of my books. But actually, my biography of Chesterton is a very good introduction because it takes you through all of his works, quoting from each of them. So that's a good introduction. But if that's difficult, it is published in Spanish, but if it's difficult to get in Chile, I would suggest a good place to start, if you like novels, either with The Man Who Was Thursday or The Ball and the Cross. Or if you prefer non-fiction, with Orthodoxy or The Everlasting Man.
En Inglaterra es muy conocida la balada del caballo blanco, que es un poema. Se conoce poco acá el poeta Chesterton. ¿Qué es difícil? No sé si usted recuerda algún verso, pero ¿por qué ese poema resulta tan significativo, fue tan importante para tanta gente, la balada del caballo blanco?
That's a good question. At the time, I think it was written at a time when Chesterton was at his most popular, and it was also published just before the First World War started. And it's about the defense of Christian civilization against the onslaught of the barbarians. So in the poem itself, of course, is about the Christian Anglo-Saxons under Alfred the Great in the 9th century AD against the invading Vikings. And the Vikings, of course, were pagans, and the Anglo-Saxons were Christians. Now, this follows, Chesterton wrote another poem about the Battle of Lepanto, very similar. In this case, of course, the Muslim navy being repulsed by a small Christian fleet. So these things were important for Chesterton. And I think during the First World War, many English people thought, and I think, I'm not sure I agree with them, because I think it's an oversimplification, but at the time of a war, many people thought that the British were defending civilization from the barbarianism of Prussia, of Germany, of German expansionism. Now, bearing in mind that 20 years later we had a second war under Nazi Germany, perhaps there was an element of truth. There was something very unhealthy in this Prussian militarism. And Chesterton certainly believed that. And this poem being written just before the First World War, I think was one of the reasons. It seemed to speak to the age.
Para nosotros, un escritor muy conocido, sobre todo en el público joven, es Tolkien. Este libro y esta saga extraordinaria, El Señor de los Anillos, se ha constituido en una manera muy interesante de aproximar un público joven a buena literatura, gran literatura y al mismo tiempo literatura muy masiva. Usted ha escrito, por lo menos yo conozco, 2 textos sobre Tolkien: Tolkien, Hombre y Mito, un interesantísimo ensayo, y una recolección de artículos de estudiosos de Tolkien, que incluye también un estudio suyo, Tolkien, Señor de la Tierra Media. Tolkien también fue católico, y usted afirma que el hecho de que sea católico no es un elemento marginal ni accidental, a diferencia de Graham Greene, que decía: yo no soy católico, no soy un escritor católico, soy un escritor que sucede que es católico. En Tolkien parece que el catolicismo está metido profundamente en su misma mitología. ¿Cuál es la clave de lectura católica del Señor de los Anillos?
Yes, well, 2 things. First of all, Tolkien himself said, and I'm quoting word for word, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work." So Tolkien himself talks about it as being fundamentally religious and Catholic. And the second thing, the key that unlocks the whole of the Lord of the Rings, and we obviously won't have time to go into greater depth, is the date on which the ring is destroyed. For non-Catholics, this date will probably mean nothing. But the ring is destroyed on March the 25th, which is the Feast of the Annunciation, which is the moment when the Word is made flesh. The medievals believed it was also the date of the crucifixion. So the ring is synonymous with sin. The one sin to rule them all is original sin. The one ring to rule them all is the ring of the book. So from that, you can, the rest of the book seems to fall into place.
Sin embargo, siempre uno ha pensado que la literatura, una novela, una buena novela, tiene muchas lecturas. ¿El hecho de leerlo en lectura católica no es reducirlo o simplificarlo? ¿Y quitarle la posibilidad de otras lecturas e interpretaciones? ¿O es tan fundamental esa interpretación?
Well, as I said, for me, I objectively speaking, as you will have gathered, a great advocate for objective reading as opposed to subjective reading. I have no problem with subjective reading, but to me it's an inferior form of reading, and critics should not make subjective reading until they can show they can objectively read it first. Now, Tolkien, who is the greatest authority on the work, as the author, with the word author, authority, says the work is fundamentally religious and Catholic. I would say that in seeing the religious dimension, you are going deeper into the work, so you will enjoy it more. That if you don't see the religious dimension, you are sort of skating on the surface, and even the surface of the Lord of the Rings is sublime, and many people have skated on the surface very happily, but really, if you go deeper, you get more out of it.
En este ensayo, Tolkien y el Renacimiento literario católico, bueno, hay muchos elementos muy bonitos, muy interesantes, pero sobre todo me gustó mucho cuando usted se detiene en alguno de los personajes de Tolkien, particularmente en la enigmática figura de Tom Bombadil, que es un arquetipo muy importante en el libro y que reúne la inocencia y la sabiduría en grado sublime, ¿no? Por ejemplo, hay un fragmento aquí del Señor de los Anillos que dice: Tom cantaba la mayor parte del tiempo, pero sobre todo cosas que no tenían sentido, o quizás en una lengua extranjera que los hobbits no conocían, una lengua antigua con palabras que eran casi todas de alegría y maravilla. También hay otro personaje que es Ramavira, y ese personaje todo ese día caminaron con él por los bosques cantando y riendo, pues Ramavira reía a menudo. Reía si el sol salía detrás de una nube, reía cuando encontraban un arroyo o un manantial, se inclinaba entonces y se refrescaba con agua a los pies y cabeza. Reía a veces cuando se oía algún sonido o murmullo de los árboles. Quisiera hablar brevemente en el último minuto que nos quedan sobre esta mirada inocente de la realidad, que también la ligamos con la mirada de Chesterton, la capacidad de ver las cosas por primera vez, y cómo eso se conecta con una mirada católica de la realidad.
Yes, Chesterton and Tolkien. Tolkien actually in his essay on fairy stories refers directly to Chesterton as somebody who shows how to restore this childlike way of seeing the world. Chesterton says that we need to stand on our heads to see the world for the first time. And when we do that, when we stand on our heads, we may realize that we're actually standing the right way up for the first time, and we've actually been standing on our heads for the whole time previously. What it's really talking about is in order to be truly wise, we have to be truly innocent. That we have to actually see the universe as the beautiful thing that it is. We have to be moved to tears by a sunrise. We have to be moved to tears by a sunrise. You know, if we're blind to sunrises because we become cynical, we stop seeing reality as it is. A sunrise is not merely light refracted through the atmosphere at a certain angle that makes those colors. A sunrise is something beautiful, and that beauty itself leads us to reason.
Por último, quisiera darme un gusto, señor Pearce. Hay varios poemas que usted cita acá de poetas extraordinarios que yo no conocía, de conversos. Yo particularmente estoy viviendo un momento de dificultad, de duda, una experiencia de dolor sobre el tema del sentido de la vida, el tema de la fe, etc. En situaciones de dolor, eso lo explica muy bien Lewis, en Una pena en observaciones, la prueba máxima para la fe, sobre todo dolores radicales. Y me impresionó mucho un poema de Benson, que usted coloca aquí en el libro, y que habla de la dificultad para elevarse a Dios, de un hombre que llega dolido y con dificultad. Yo lo voy a leer en castellano, y le voy a pedir que usted lo lea en inglés para sentir la música de ese idioma maravilloso de la poesía, para cerrar el programa. No sé qué le parece. ¿Ah? Y el poema dice así: no puedo elevarme y cantar a mi Señor y mi amor. No tengo las alas del águila, ni fuerza para alzarme y saludar a mi Rey, ni corazón para volar. Señor Creador encarnado, déjame apoyar mi pesada carga en ti. No permitas que mi inmensa debilidad se interponga entre tu fuerza y yo. No puedo conocer tu providencia ni dónde estás, ni alcanzar vagamente qué eres tú y qué es el hombre y cuál es el final. En medio de este desierto no puedo encontrar la senda que pisó el hombre prudente. Concédeme descansar en ti, Espíritu encarnado y Verbo de Dios. No puedo amar, mi corazón está embotado y cerrado bajo llave, ay de mí. Mi egoísmo me hace estremecer, el pecado ha extraviado la llave. Oh Sagrado Corazón de Jesús, llama divina que arde de deseo, mi esperanza está puesta en tu amor, profundo abismo de fuego. No puedo vivir solo ni una hora más. Jesús, sé tú mi vida, no tengo fuerzas para luchar, sé tú mi fuerza en toda contienda. No puedo hacer nada, ni esperar, ni querer, ni tener, tan solo tropezar y querer, y caer. Sé tú mi alma y yo mismo, sé yo mismo, amado Jesús, mi Dios y mi todo. Poema impresionante de un poeta que cae de rodillas, pero sin poder creer que es Benson. Y me gustaría que usted lo leyera en inglés, porque en inglés debe sonar mejor que en castellano. Please.
I cannot soar and sing my Lord and love. No eagle's wings have I. No power to rise and greet my King above. No heart to fly. Creative Lord incarnate, let me lean my heavy self on thee, nor let my utter weakness come between thy strength and me. I cannot trace thy providence and place, nor dimly comprehend what in thyself thou art and what is man, and what the end. Here in the wilderness I cannot find the path the wise men trod. Grant me to rest on thee, incarnate mind, and word of God. I cannot love, my heart is turned within, and locked within, ah me, how shivering in self-love I sit, for sin has lost the key. Ah, Sacred Heart of Jesus, flame divine, ardent with great desire, my hope is set upon that love of thine, deep well of fire. I cannot live alone another hour. Jesus, be thou my life. I have not power to strive. Be thou my power in every strife. I could do nothing, hope nor love nor fear, but only fail and fall. Be thou my soul and self, O Jesus dear, my God and all.
Señor Joseph Pearce, yo le agradezco muchísimo esta conversación terminar con este poema que de alguna manera intenta ser una respuesta al duro monólogo de Macbeth sobre el sinsentido y la vida como un cuento contado por un idiota. Muchas gracias por acercarnos a esta maravillosa literatura y por compartir con nosotros su experiencia vital y literaria. Bienvenido a Chile.
Thank you so much. Thank you.